So another day and the pandemonium in Tuscaloosa continues, and today there's a lot we need to talk about. We need to talk about the newest entrance into the transfer portal from Alabama and former five-star quarterback Julian Sayin and what this means for the Tide. But in better news, we need to talk about a massive weekend ahead of Coach Kalen DeBoer and this Alabama staff, as several incredibly talented players make their way to Tuscaloosa, and we have got to break it down. But before we can, as always, y'all know the drill. I have got to hear from you. Hop down to the comments, give me a Y for yes or an N for no. Are you surprised that Julian Sayin enters the transfer portal? And let me know what you're thinking. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe, hit that bell notification as I do constant college football content. You don't want to miss any of it, and if you enjoyed the content, be sure to like and comment down below. But having said all that, let's jump right into this. And of course, we're going to start with the newest member of the former Alabama Crimson Tide to put their name in the transfer portal, and that's none other than former five-star quarterback Julian Sayin. And Julian Sayin is a guy that just got to Tuscaloosa within the month, and this is a big loss. There's no two ways around it. Julian Sayin is an incredibly talented quarterback and one that Alabama fans everywhere were really excited to see play for the Crimson Tide. But when you look into it, there's some things that make it make sense. First and foremost, he was really high on playing for Nick Saban, and Nick Saban's no longer there. Secondly, the former offensive coordinator that was so big in his recruiting process, Tommy Rees, no longer there. Bill O'Brien, the guy who initiated some recruiting process with Julian Sayin, or at least that was the offensive coordinator for Alabama when Julian Sayin committed to the Crimson Tide, he's no longer there. And Holloman Wiggins, the guy who's tabbed as the primary recruiter for Sayin, is no longer on staff. So with this much transition, at some level it does make sense, the same way we've talked about with all these transfers. Look, Nick Saban leaving Alabama, that's a big deal. It's not only a big deal for the players on Alabama's roster, but as Coach Prime pointed out the other day, you look at the ripple effects around college football, just proving how impactful that one move was. So Julian Sayin entering the transfer portal, it's going to be interesting to see where he ends up, but I also think it's important to note that Alabama still has got a lot of talent in this quarterback room. You still have Jalen Milroe, you have former five-star Ty Simpson, you have Dylan Lonergan, who people around the program, people who got to see him play, said was exceptionally impressive, and then you bring in Austin Mack. And though Alabama fans may not be familiar with Austin Mack, if you listen to the people around the Washington program, whether that be the fans or whether that be the people that covered the Huskies, they are really high on this kid. They said he has an unreal ceiling, and Coach DeBoer and Coach Grubb are exceptionally high on Austin Mack, and they've gotten to work with him for the past year. So it's going to be interesting to see what other movement occurs, but let's get into some more positive news, because luckily for Alabama's fans everywhere, we have some positive news to get into. Alabama is set to host several incredibly talented prospects this weekend in Coach DeBoer's first big visit weekend, and today we need to break it down. We're going to start with the guy who was previously committed to Alabama and Ryan Williams, who decommitted, and a lot of Alabama fans feared the worst. However, there's been some interesting developments ever since this new staff has been assembled, and personally, I think that it's an enticing prospect to play for Coach DeBoer, Coach Grubb, and Coach Shepard because of what they've done on the offensive side of the football, because of the numbers they've put up with the wide receivers in their offense. And if you are Ryan Williams, you're one of the most exceptionally gifted athletes in the nation, not just wide receivers, but pure football players that there is in the nation. There's a reason why he reclassified and is still a top 15 player. That's how good he is. If you're a wide receiver, it's got to be enticing to think about playing for some of the coaches on Alabama's roster. And luckily for Alabama fans, things have been moving in a positive direction. Look, there's still an uphill battle with Ryan Williams. Several big-time programs out there are reaching out and doing their best, such as Texas, such as Auburn. But he had a lot of relationships in the building at Alabama. And it was interesting to see the other day when a team meeting was called that Ryan Williams showed up. In my opinion, that's a huge positive for the Alabama Crimson Tide, and especially because not only was he there for the team meeting, but he's coming back this weekend. That has to be a positive development for Alabama. And Ryan Williams, like I said, a guy that every Alabama fan everywhere would like to have. How about another guy in the recruiting class, Noah Carter, someone who is exceptionally talented. We looked at his film yesterday over on Kyle Henderson's YouTube channel and broke it down, and Alabama, if they get this commitment, is in a position where I actually have no idea where he would play. if you look at 24/7 Sports, they have him listed as an edge, but if you start watching his huddle film, this kid was all over the place. He was playing edge, he was returning punts, he was returning kicks, he was out as a slot wide receiver, an outside wide receiver, a tight end. He's exceptionally gifted. He stands 6'4", 220 pounds, and the coaching staff, if they get this commitment, is going to be in a position where I can imagine the offensive coaches and the defensive coaches are going to be fighting in rooms as to which side of the ball he will end up with. But this would be a massive win for Alabama, and it would be a really exciting player to see come and contribute for the Crimson Tide. But let's get into some other guys in the transfer portal that we need to be looking out for. First and foremost, we're going to talk about another wide receiver in Jeremy Bernard transferring from Washington, and a guy who a lot of the people that cover Washington and the Washington Huskies thought would be a potential wide receiver one for the Huskies in 2024. He is exceptionally talented. He got a lot of play this year, and he has got a ton of ability. And if Alabama could get this commitment, it would be a big win. Once again, I'm not concerned about Alabama's offense. When you look at the coaching staff that's been assembled, I think it's exciting. From offensive line coach to retaining Robert Gillespie to the wide receivers coach, the offensive coordinator that Nick Saban originally wanted in Kalen DeBoer, a guy that's been so successful coaching offenses. You have to imagine that they're able to retain the talent on roster and add in some names, such as a name like a Jeremy Bernard or a name we're going to talk about here very shortly. Alabama's offense will be in a good position. But what's the other name I just referenced? Well, how about a Parker Brailsford? Parker Brailsford was a part of the Joe Moore-winning offensive line up at Washington, and he entered the transfer portal. Alabama needs a center. They had center problems all year long, and this guy has a lot of experience at the center position. This would be a massive win for Alabama, and this was even something I was talking about before Nick Saban retired, was that I wouldn't have been surprised if Alabama was looking in the portal for a center anyways, just given how this year played out, right? Given the struggles at that position. If you can get in a guy like Brailsford, who's so battle-tested, who is well-coached, and who has the familiarity with some of the coaches in the building, I think that's a massive win. But speaking of familiarity, let's talk about a name on the defensive side of the ball, a name that would be a home run win for this staff, but it's not going to come easy, and that's Jabar Muhammad. Now, for those of you in the know, Jabar Muhammad was an absolute lockdown corner for the Washington Huskies, a real big part of that defense, and he entered the transfer portal. It seems to be a battle between Alabama and Texas, though reports do say Oregon is a team to watch as well. He just got off of a visit from Texas, and he is currently in Tuscaloosa, if I'm not mistaken, but I know he's going to be there this weekend. And Jabar Muhammad, like Parker Brailsford, like Jeremy Bernard, has a familiarity with this coaching staff and Coach DeBoer and Coach Huff, several members. That gives Alabama an interesting position to start their recruiting pitch from. On top of that, you have instant playing time ahead of you because of how much movement Alabama has experienced in that defensive backroom, which, when you really think about it, makes a lot of sense in that there's going to be a new defensive coordinator, there's going to be a new cornerback coach, and a lot of those guys committed to play for Nick Saban because of the work he does with defensive backs, and Nick Saban is no longer there. So it's not inherently surprising to see so much movement from that room, but it only underscores why Jabar Muhammad would be so valuable for Alabama. And make no mistake, this is not going to be an easy win. Even though he has the familiarity with the Alabama coaching staff, he's from the state of Texas. His cousin plays cornerback for the Texas Longhorns, Manny Muhammad, very young player with a huge upside, looks to really take off in the 2024 season, and the prospect at playing at home with family, that's got to be compelling. But as we've seen time and time again, home and proximity is not the end-all be-all. If it was, he may have ended up at Texas the first go-around. Instead, he chose to leave and go to Washington. So, while proximity is always something that we need to discuss, it is always a drop in the bucket, it doesn't necessarily mean it is the end-all be-all in a recruiting process. It is going to be something we have to watch. So as we've seen so many times this week, and as we've said so many times this week, you just kind of have to roll with the punches right now. You have to ride the wave. That's the position that Alabama fans are currently in. If you're looking for any good news, the roster currently sits at above 75 scholarships right now. And yes, there have been a lot of big hits to the roster. I'm not going to argue that. That is a very true point. It'd be facetious trying to argue it. But I do think it's important to note that for as much movement as has occurred, a lot of this movement was expected. Before Nick Saban retired, I was sitting right here saying, hey, expect another 10, 12, 13 guys to enter the transfer portal. Well, now you have that plus the result of Nick Saban retiring. So yes, there's been a lot of movement, but I do think it's important to note that Alabama is currently sitting above 75 scholarships on the roster right now, which is still a really good place to be. They're going to look to the transfer portal to try and mitigate some of these losses, and then they have the spring portal window in front of them. So the roster has taken hits, but there's still a lot of talent available for this roster, available for this new coaching staff, and it's going to be exciting to see what comes next. But I can't wait to hear from all of you. Hop down to the comments. Let me know what you're thinking. That's it. See ya.